Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel and welcome to my omnibus series. I've got so many of these omnibuses that are going to come out so that you'll be able to listen to an hour's worth of stories, which I know you're going to love. You know, the thing is that telling stories is such a fine art, and it's something that was practiced hundreds of years ago when people didn't have the technology that we have today. And everyone would gather around the fire and listen to a wonderful story. And also, what is so wonderful about a story is that personally, I think it is the best way to go to sleep. Every night when I go to bed, I always listen to stories. And that's something that parents used to do with their children. It's something that they still do with their children. There's nothing better than a good story. And so I hope you're going to enjoy this series. And before we start, I just want to say, do subscribe to my channel because you don't want to miss out on anything. Because I'm in for the long haul and I want to make sure that you get the most stunning stories to go to bed with at night or to listen to when you want to be one of those people sitting beside the fire and listening. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel and let's get started. I hope you're going to enjoy the omnibus.
Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is George and I'm from a quaint little picturesque village in Derbyshire in England. And my Bigfoot encounter happened to me in the 80s when I was about 23 years old in Brazil of all places. I grew up with my parents and a brother called Walter, and we had a really phenomenal childhood growing up. We grew up in a world where crime was very uncommon, so as kids we were pretty much able to do as we pleased, without the interference of modern technology or nagging overcautious parents. My brother and I adored horse riding, fishing and cycling, and we could be seen riding our bicycles all over the Derbyshire countryside. When we rode past our village in our bicycle down some of those long country roads, we would invariably cycle past exquisitely beautiful meadows, rolling green hills, and grazing fields of cows, sheep and even horses. Our little terrier mixed dog called Mops literally followed us everywhere on those exciting adventures and never grew tired. I remember when I was about 10 years old, I was nearly killed by a herd of very inquisitive cows that could quite literally have trampled and stomped me to death. It would seem to be on this occasion that the cows had a probing curiosity and interest towards Mops, my dog, for some bizarre reason. Believe me, inquiring quizzical cows are highly problematic. Before long we were surrounded by cows everywhere that were closing in tightly on us and mooing. We were seconds away from being squashed and pounded to death, unintentionally of course by these creatures because their bodies are so large, and they could easily have flattened us in a heartbeat. I knew of a boy who had actually lost his life this way to a herd of trampeding cows. I knew I had to escape, and luckily I managed to squeeze under a fence and rolled through to the other side, with my body almost shredded to pieces by the barbed wire, and with a rather bedraggled, frightened Mops by my side. I was really shaken up by that incident, and even Mops became painfully wary of cows from that point on, and would simply refuse to go into a field if there was a cow in sight, and who could blame him? Believe it or not, I was once also attacked by a male billy goat, whom had been placed in the field by the farmer to impregnate the female goats. Sadly, I wasn't aware of that at the time. I was accessing the hiking trail I was on through the field, which was legally accessible to all the hikers as a natural shortcut. I remember this creature literally pounded me with its horns so hard that my body was literally black and blue from bruising. I tried to escape this testosterone-driven billy goat, but he was not letting me out of his sight, and he was tearing after me and charging me, using his horns like deadly weapons. Finally, I was rescued by the farmer, who was killing himself laughing and trying desperately not to, because it was comical seeing his billy goat strutting his stuff like that. I hate to admit it, that the Derbyshire villagers could not suppress their amusement and laughter at my very sorry sight, and thought it was terribly funny that a male billy goat had seen me as a potential mating threat, as far as mating was concerned. When I went to the doctor, he was so shocked by how I looked and said, "I'll be damned, I've seen everything now." For some reason the male billy goat thought I was another male competing for mating rights, and he was having none of that. I promise you I've never been so beat up and bruised in my entire life. I soon became the butt of many jokes in the village. When I was a little older, my parents sent us to a prestigious boarding school because my father believed in the significance of a high-quality education to empower and enhance our lives. He was also insistent that we needed to have 3 skills in life because he said that it would be an insurance policy for our financial futures. He felt that you could never ever be certain of the future, so 3 skills would set us up for life. I must say, I have never regretted following his stringent advice. So even though I was an aspiring medical student at the time that was desirous of becoming an orthopedic surgeon, I had also developed the skills of being a barber, and I learnt how to do that cutthroat shave to perfection at a local barber shop, and became so good at those clean-cut shaves that the barber literally begged me to work for him full-time. My third and final skill would be learning how to become a bricklayer, and so off I went to London to acquire some building skills. I remember how tough it was to get accommodation in London in those days, and you literally had to fight tooth and nail to get a bedsit. I would look for advertisements in the Evening Standard for accommodation, and invariably it would always have gone. Just my luck. It was maddening. There would be queues of people answering just one advert for a single room, so it was a living nightmare looking for affordable, cheap accommodation in London because the demands were so great. I want to tell you those greedy landlords in London were squirreling away monstrous fortunes, and if you were to complain about something, they would simply tell you could leave because competition for bedsits in London was exceedingly fierce. So in reality, they could literally get away with almost anything and offering you substandard accommodation. But beggars could not be choosers in those days, I'm sad to say. Finally, I was able to find a rather decent-sized bedsit in Bayswater, and as the building project I was working on was in High Street, Kensington, it was in very convenient location for me. The white building where I'd moved to was a classical piece of stylized, sophisticated architecture, but on the inside it was a very different story, as the place was quite literally falling apart, and even the staircases to the rooms were covered in threadbare carpets, and there was only one bathroom to be shared between 5 bedsits, which was absolutely ridiculous. I think the thing that shocked me the most was the electric connections in the rooms that looked so old and precarious you'd be forgiven for thinking that you could literally have a serious electric shock, and you probably could. So I decided that I would never be using an iron in that bedsit. Bayswater was metropolitan and was buzzing with people of all nationalities from all parts of the globe, and there was a great deal of Arabs in the area, wearing their typical white turbans and white loose clothes. In the building where I lived, there were some interesting characters. There was a young girl who was an upmarket cool girl and was visited regularly by her pimp. There were several bricklayers living in their bedsits who were working on local building site. And then there were many bedsits that were occupied by young girls from Brazil who were rarely staying in London for some life experience. And then there was a couple of Australian backpackers in another bedsit. I was enjoying my bricklaying experience, and it was physically strenuous and exhausting hard work, but I learnt a huge amount, and years later I was able to build my own house from scratch, so it was a massive advantage possessing another skill. My father was definitely right about that. One day as I was climbing the stairs to my bedsit, having returned from a hard day of work, I bumped into one of the Brazilian girls in our building, who was sharing a very large bedsit with 3 very friendly Brazilian girls, who invited me to join her for drinks at the local pub, and I thought it sounded like a fabulous idea. The pubs in London were always such a lovely way to relax after a strenuous hard day, and even enjoy a nice game of darts or 2. To cut a long story short, I became very good friends with the Brazilian girl, who was called Anka, but it was not a romantic liaison by any strength of the imagination. We just became very close, firm and good friends, and before long Anka told me all about her life in Brazil and begged me to go and stay with her once she had left England and returned home. Once I had acquired my building skills, I returned home to Derbyshire, and my parents encouraged me to go travelling to broaden my horizons for a year or so before I pursued and completed my medical degree. Once again my father told me that travel was character building and good for the soul. He believed it was favourable and valuable to observe other cultures, faiths and lifestyles, and to learn from other people's life experiences. I did not need much encouragement because I loved travelling myself, And that was when I decided to visit Brazil and get reacquainted with Anka, who lived in a very nice neighbourhood in São Paulo. She lived in an upmarket white Portuguese home with seamless 1800s colonial architecture and a touch of neoclassic romantic influences, and it was spacious, open plan, and rarely cosy, well-designed home. It would seem that the garrulous and charming Anka had hundreds and hundreds of friends, and so she hosted numerous parties while I was there. I found the Brazilians to be very gregarious, friendly and congenial, and they just loved a good party and dancing to all hours of the morning. We visited pristine white beaches, and believe me, those beaches were among the most magnificent I've ever seen in the world, I imagine. I travelled all over Brazil, meeting some very interesting characters, and I enjoyed eating delicious Brazilian food. I noticed they love cooking with black beans in their dishes, but for me nothing was tastier than the picanha, which is a barbecued meat, and I was also rather partial to a feijoada, which is a hearty pork stew with black beans. One day Anka and I decided to go camping in a large wooded area of natural forest that consisted of luxurious vegetation, along with myrtle, laurel, palm, acacia, rosewood, Brazil nut, rubber, and Amazonian mahogany trees. After walking for a long while, we encountered a couple of sloths, and they were just so beautiful to watch, and they were hanging upside down and looking at us rather curiously, and it seemed that they were undaunted and unfazed by our appearance. We also encountered the most amazing birds, from the toucans to the parrots and macaws and hummingbirds, and as I've always loved birds, I was completely overwhelmed to observe such colourful birds. They were spectacular. I remember we were hot and sweaty, and we were being bitten alive by mosquitoes and other carnivorous-looking insects that seemed all too eager to eat us alive. Sadly, Anka had completely forgotten to bring any insect repellent with us, something that you should never do in the Brazilian forest. Some parts of the woods were so overgrown that we had to literally use a machete to cut our way through the forest, I kid you not. It was not long before Anka and I found a place to camp for the night, in a large open clearing beside a gushing pebbly stream that meandered and spiralled through the whole valley. It was very enchanting, magical, and terribly pretty, and we got the fire going to do our best to try and smoke out those obnoxious eating insects. It really was a sublime, enchanting evening, and the magical sounds of the forest were alive with the sounds of crickets and frogs, and there were other more intimidating roars and howls to be heard from animals that were clearly predators of some kind. Anka and I were feeling so much better as the smoke from our fire pit was successful in warding off those flesh-eating nasty bugs, and it was somewhat of a protection against predators, giving us a secure feeling of safety. There's nothing like a good fire to do that for you. We had set up a large tent in the open clearing, and we sat by our fire pit, talking and enjoying plastic glasses of cheap boxed red wine. It was such a bright, magical, cheerful night, with a golden white glaze from the full moon and silver sparkle from the twinkling stars, although there was a large canopy above us, that the light of the moon danced through the branches and lit up the entire clearing, quite brightly, I might add. Not to mention the light of the oil lamp, which also enabled us to view our map and discuss whereabouts we were to travel in the morning, because it is easy to get so lost in these forests, and so we needed to make absolutely sure we charted a reliable course for ourselves. I was lucky because Anka had a great deal of hiking experience behind her, as her father had once been a forest tour guide, so I knew I was in exceedingly safe hands with Anka's vast, invaluable knowledge of the Brazilian forest. Suddenly, before we knew it, we were surrounded, just from nowhere, by hundreds of monkeys that were eagerly rifling through our belongings to see if they could find any edibles. All our stuff was being flung all over the place. One of the monkeys opened our fruit bag and proceeded to eat a banana with great gusto, looking at us as if it was no big deal, while the other monkeys tried to tear the fruit bag away from him. But the naughty little critter held on to it for dear life and had absolutely no intention of sharing with anyone. Not in your life. He had an animated expression on his face, as if he'd most certainly won the food diving lottery. "Where on earth did they come from?" I asked Anka. "I think they've been watching us for quite some time," she said. "They're amazing at remaining invisible." We were trying to stop the monkeys from going through my backpack that was filled with all our food supplies for the next couple of days, but they weren't fearful of us at all, which was exceedingly frustrating. I tried to shoo them away, but with very little effect. Suddenly we heard the most terrifying roar that was so petrifying that it actually caused the ground to vibrate and shudder beneath us. We could literally feel the ground move. We heard these heavy bipedal feet thundering towards our campsite, and as they sprinted towards us, we could hear tree limbs breaking and tree branches crunching. It truly sounded like a trampeding elephant in musk was charging at us and rampaging through the undergrowth like a heavy bulldozer on full throttle. In terror, the monkeys just scattered, and I noticed that they seemed all too familiar with that sound, as if they knew what was charging us, and they had no intention of hanging around whatsoever. Suddenly standing yards away from us was this apex predator. I don't know how else to describe him to you. He was a monstrous giant, such as the likes that I have never ever seen before. The creature was literally titanic in its vast mammoth proportions, and was easily 9 foot tall, 900 pounds, and 4 feet wide. The first instinctive impression I procured from this creature was that it was a human giant, literally covered in dense, thick black hair, with the exception, of course, of the long grey face that was hairless and had a leathery but human-like appearance to it. This colossal creature was built like an army tank. It was burly, thick and muscular, and its overlong arms and human-like hands and feet were remarkably like humans, but so much larger. The creature barely acknowledged us as his focus was on our large rucksacks. The critter pounded his chest a few times with his massive fists and let out a thunderous roar, which I believed was designed to intimidate the monkeys that we had just seen, including the other forest animals, to affirm his high-ranking position, as I imagine king of the forest, which he most certainly was. We watched in absolute horror and in awe at the same time, if that's possible, as this colossal critter glided towards our backpacks, rifling through them with jubilant enthusiasm like a kid emptying out a Christmas stocking. He looked exactly like that. The critter tossed the things that were of no interest to him at all over his shoulders like plastic plates and cutlery that went flying haphazardly into the air. Along went a book with him, a hairbrush, camera, binoculars, and they were literally scattered liberally all over our campsite. It was a massive mess. Finally, the creature came to our delicious food parcels, and he placed all the things he wanted in a very neat particular pile that included raw bacon pieces, cashew nuts, potato chips, a big block of sweaty cheddar cheese, biscuits, beef jerky, grapes, and plenty of dried fruit. He opened the box of red wine, took a sip, and spat it out in absolute disgust and revulsion, pouring it across the clearing, with all the contents sadly spilling out. Gone was all our delicious red wine. He then examined all the inedible items to see if anything was interesting enough for him to take, and nothing held the remotest appeal to him, I'm glad to say, so he discarded everything, including our freeze-dried food, which he tossed on the forest floor. He proceeded to pile our fresh food into my rucksack, and then he threw the rucksack over his gargantuan back, and this large rucksack, I kid you not, looked just like a handbag on his shoulders. It looked so small. It was in that moment that he looked up and gave a warning growl to us, much like a Rottweiler dog that guards his food. It was like he was saying, "This stuff is all mine. Don't even dream of challenging me." And then the creature just thundered away through the forest, barely giving us a second glance. But, boy, did he leave behind a lot of shock. All the while Anchor and I had watched this creature, we were beginning to believe we were seeing things like the effect you might get from a psychedelic drug. I say that because until you've seen this creature up close and personal for yourself, you will only then comprehend how incongruous it seems in our natural reality. It really seemed so out of place, and yet it was larger than life, and real it most certainly was. We did not just see what I think we saw, I asked Anchor, who was shaking like a leaf, and her eyes had grown as wide as saucers. "So it's true," she said, looking absolutely dazed. My father told me about the coal-black giant in the forest when he went on hiking trails, but I just thought he was trying to scare us. I had absolutely no idea it was true." "Your father told you about this critter?" I asked in horror. "Oh, yes," she said. "Believe me, I've got some stories to tell you that would make your hair curl. I just thought they were all spurious, but now I think they were true. I truly thought it was all fictitious stuff. But now I've seen the creature for myself, I'm in no doubt that he's real. As you can imagine, after meeting the coal-black giant in the woods like we did, my nerves were most definitely frazzled, as I have never been so frightened in all my life, and so I literally begged and pleaded at Anchor to let us leave the campsite the following morning, as that coal-black creature scared the living daylights out of me, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. Looking back all these years later, I do realise we encountered a Bigfoot, which I am certain is equally as abundant in Brazil as in North America, only the locals are less inclined to talk about it, largely due to superstitious reasons. I'm still very good friends with Anchor and speak to her regularly, and so I'm sure she will send you some interesting Bigfoot encounters from people who have encountered the beast themselves, and I'm sure your listeners will be very entertained. All these years later, that event is the most profound in my entire life, so I hope your listeners enjoyed my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Janice, and I did not personally have a Bigfoot encounter, but my cousin Hugh most certainly did, and he will be telling you his story through this anonymous forum after much coaxing and persuading from me, which was not easy, I assure you. My mother is initially from Manchester in England, and she married my American father, and subsequently emigrated from England and moved to North America, where they finally settled down in rural Kentucky, where I subsequently was born. My mother's sister stayed in Manchester and married a Londoner, and they both moved to Chelsea in London, where Hugh was born, who was obviously my cousin on my mother's side of the family. My story begins in the late 70s, when I was about 18 years old, and my mother wanted me to fly to London to stay with my aunt and uncle in their Chelsea apartment and to meet my cousin Hugh. I was terribly excited because I'd never flown on an international flight before, and I'd also never met my cousin, nor had I ever visited London, and I'd heard so many things about the place. I remember arriving in London, which was one of the most exciting, exhilarating experiences of my entire life that I can never, ever forget. I could feel the vibe and buzzing energy of this vivacious, exuberant, charming city, and it was unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my entire life. My heart was fluttering with excitement, and I remember climbing in the back of a black London taxicab, where I was greeted by a friendly Cockney cabbie. "Where are you from, love?" he asked. "I'm from Kentucky in America," I replied. "That's a long way from home. Have you ever been to London before, love?" "No, this is my first time," I said. "I'm going to be staying with my mother's family in Chelsea." "Do you need the address?" I asked. "Not really, love. Just give me the name of the street. I know London like the back of my hand." As I looked out of the taxi window, I was in total awe. I could sense the palpable history of this great, remarkable, intriguing city. There were red London buses, black London taxi cabs, cars and people bustling around, minding their own business. There were exquisite, classic, imposing buildings that looked like architectural masterpieces, interesting, prestigious, regal-looking statues of both lions and dragons. There were bright red London telephone boxes, and gorgeous parks covered with emerald green grass and dotted with tall, majestic, statuesque oaks. When we passed Buckingham Palace, I was in utter reverence at the extraordinary pomp and ceremony of the palace itself, which appeared so palatial, stately and magisterial, and I could see the dignified palace guards, dressed in black and red, standing imposingly in front of the noble imperial palace. Chelsea was very classy. It was stylish, exclusive, and a high-class area. It was certainly a prestigious, upscale, expensive part of London. Of that there was no doubt. The perfect symmetrical residential apartment blocks were painted in white, and very smart and classical, with attractive design motifs done in pretty spirals. There was large white rectangular windows, white stylized columns and porches that were topped with pediment. Then there was dark wrought iron work done in classic twirls and frills, creating very distinguished-looking balustrades that framed the outer entrances to the buildings and the lower staircases to the basement apartments. I could quite literally imagine the horse and wagons from times gone by trotting down these quaint little streets, and men from the past wearing their top hat and tails. It was a nostalgic sense of history that was so clearly palpable to me that I could see it, feel it, and taste it, much like a time traveller transporting myself back in time. It truly felt like that. My aunt and uncle were delighted to meet me, and they were warm, congenial, and welcoming, and incredibly British with very polished upscale London accents. "Oh, my dear," said my aunt, "you do look just like your mother when she was your age, and the likeness is quite remarkable. It really is uncanny. So what do you think of London so far?" she asked me. "Beautiful," I said. "Quite beautiful. We're going to take you to Carnaby Street, well, at least I am, dear, where your cousin Hugh works, selling leather belts and studs. I do think I should warn you, it's going to be a bit of a culture shock for you, and I do think Hugh's appearance might be rather unsettling and perturbing for you, but I want to assure you he's an absolute honey bunch and a sweetie pie to boot, and I know he cannot wait to meet you." I wondered what on earth my aunt meant by culture shock. What did she mean when she said I'd be shocked by my cousin's appearance, I wondered. My aunt hailed down a taxicab on the side of the road, and the taxi dropped us off at Carnaby Street. It was like a bustling world of blazing bright colours and exhilarating excitement. I know of no other way to describe it to you, only that it was simply, utterly marvellous, and words fail me to chronicle for you the electrifying, stirring and thrilling ambience of this compelling place. Strange-looking eccentric people were absolutely everywhere. In fact, I was the one that stood out among the punk rockers in my very average conservative American clothes that seemed positively drab by contrast to everybody else. Everyone was attired in punk rock styles, with divergent, spiky hairstyles highlighted in bright colours that looked remarkably like hedgehogs or the spikes down a dragon's tail. I'd never seen so many wacko mohawks or Mohicans, I think you call them that, with their peculiar, idiosyncratic hairstyles that possibly required a gallon of hair gel to stick up like that. The hair was dyed in the brightest colours, whites, reds, pinks and greens. The punks all had piercings in their ears and down the sides of their earlobes, in their noses and on the edges of their lips, and even, believe it or not, on their tongues, not to mention their nipples were also pierced. Some punks had their ear skins stretched deliberately so there were 2 large gaping holes in the earlobes. The clothes they wore were incredible. For the females, they literally loved the black watch tartan skater dress or pleated short skirts with platform shoes, leather jackets, oversized cardigans, combat boots, and holy tights. I noticed the men tended to wear spiked clothing. Scowl rings and heavily studded leather boots were the order of the day, along with lots of studded leather jewellery like dog collars and hand collars, as well as belts. I kid you not, the vibe of this city was remarkable, unlike anything that I've ever experienced in my entire life, and the individual punk rock styles were utterly amazing, and they ranged from being very unusual to being quirky and different, that you could have been forgiven for believing that you had entered the Twilight Zone and encountered a whole new species of human being. I promise you, the late 70s and 80s were possibly one of the most exciting times to be alive in London history, because the city was literally electric with excitement, and the best music in modern memory. Let's not forget that either. I was so excited by all these unorthodox punk rock people with their novel, kinky makeup, exciting, spiked, colourful hairstyles, studded and sometimes even tattooed bodies. I just remember walking down Carnaby Street with my mouth open in shock and my eyes the size of tennis balls. It was a whole new world for me that seemed so surreal, as I'd never known so many exotic, quirky people like this before, and they all appeared so uniquely different that each person looked like a non-conforming work of art. In Carnaby Street there were dozens of quintessential tourist shops, with circulating racks of colourful postcards, often of the punks themselves, and souvenirs of London such as the potato sack shopping bags with Carnaby Street, Oxford Street and King's Road logos printed on them. There were mugs, key rings and miniature London buses, as well as little toy soldiers, plates and London posters that were all for sale as well. Then there were shops literally filled with rocking music that was pumping throughout the day, along with shops that would sell leather, studded belts and all the stylized punk rock regalia. I was so bedazzled and bewitched by this amazing place, and the vibe was unlike anything I'd ever encountered before. It was vibrant and incredibly exciting. "It's a whole other world," said my aunt, looking at my animated face and laughing. "I see you like it." "Oh, yes, I do," I said. "It's amazing. I've never seen anything like it before. Such an exhilarating buzz with people dressing rebelliously to shock, amaze, and draw attention to themselves. It's a whole nother world," I said. "I can't imagine what my parents would think if they were here." "Just as well they're not," she said. "Now to meet your cousin," said my aunt. "This is going to be a culture shock," she said. "He manages the punk rock den shop over there," she said. I followed my aunt up a couple of steps into a cosy shop where there was this vibey synthesizer music playing. There was an area where people were having piercings done, as well as a very interesting looking tattoo parlour that was very busy, and there were racks of spiky leather jackets and punk rock belts for sale. I saw a young man standing behind the shop counter, looking much like all the other punk rockers that I'd seen earlier during the day walking down Carnaby Street, which made him appear dauntingly unapproachable to me. He had whiter than white spiked hair that stood up in 5 big dragon spikes down the centre of his head, while the side of his head was meticulously shaved. He had 2 massive big black studs in both of his ears, and small silver studs down the side of his earlobes. He also had studs in his nose and on the edges of his mouth, and if it was at all possible, even on his tongue. He was wearing smart jeans that were heavily studied, and a dog collar around his neck, and a spiky punk rock black leather jacket was worn over his bare chest, which was heavily tattooed with eagles, and he had 2 prominent nipple piercings. I noticed his face was so made up, with very dramatic colours, just like Boy George would actually wear. I followed my aunt to the counter where my cousin Hugh was standing with a welcoming broad beam on his face. It was hard to fathom that he was actually my cousin. He seemed like a colourful, out-of-world, exotic human species, but when he opened his mouth, he spoke with such a lovely, soft London accent and seemed very normal and approachable, which was incongruous with his eye-catching appearance, let me tell you. It was not long before I realised that despite our differences, Hugh and I had so much in common, and he gallantly took me all over London and introduced me to all his peculiar but very charming punk rock friends. On one occasion, my cousin's friend made me up with a funky hairstyle to look like a punk rocker myself, and it was incredibly fun. I barely recognised myself in the mirror when I stared at my blonde hair that had been transformed into bright pink spikes, and I was wearing combat boots, black holey tights, a black spiky jacket, and a black watch tartan skirt, which is that red and black tartan traditional short-pleated skirt that you see. It was very liberating to dress like this, and believe me, I've never had so much fun. It really was one of the most exciting times in my life, and I would go so far as to say that the buzzing vibe of the late 70s and early 80s in London was unlike anything that I have ever known and experienced in my entire life. It was an incredibly exciting time to be alive. The music of the late 70s and early 80s was literally the best music I have ever known. I was to learn that these punk rockers hated the establishment and prided themselves in not conforming to society's expectations or stereotypes of them. They prided themselves in individuality, looking and being different. They used their shocking, colourful appearances as a tool to express their identity and individuality, and I admired that greatly. Before long, I developed an incredible relationship with Hugh, and we were both single children without brothers and sisters, so he became like a brother, and the brother that I never had, and I became like a sister to him. By the time I had to leave London, I felt as if I had known my mother's sister and her family all my life, and a close bond had been formed. Hugh and I began writing to each other about twice a week, and in those days, getting an overseas letter was terribly, terribly exciting. Imagine my amazement when I realised that Hugh was coming to stay with me in rural Kentucky on our farm. I had one looming concerning thought at the back of my mind, and that was how Hugh was going to be perceived by my friends in Kentucky because of the startling, shocking way he looked. I realised it was going to be an interesting and curious time, and my friends and parents would be in for a surprise awakening. They would soon learn that there were other colourful humans in the world, with a dress code uniquely their own. I had lived in rural Kentucky all my life, and we lived on a large farm where we grew corn, raised chickens, and managed a small dairy herd. We lived in a rather lovely rustic-looking farmhouse, very traditional of the time, that was painted in pale lemon creamy yellow, with white sash windows and shutters, and a black slate roof. We also had a few outbuildings and sheds on our property, and 2 lovely Newfoundland dogs. On the right-hand side of our property was a very large wooded area that consisted primarily of oaks, maples, walnuts and pine trees, and there were woods which were quite literally teeming with an abundance of wildlife, especially white-tailed deer. On one occasion we'd had too many wild hog on our land that had been culled because they were doing so much damage to the environment, but luckily it never presented a problem again, as clearly there were other predators keeping the hog population at bay. On the northern side of our property was the most magnificent silvery lake that you have ever seen, that was surrounded by a high hilly embankment, and also large pretty trees. It was an exquisite area that attracted the most phenomenal bird life that you have ever seen, and wild duck were a firm favourite with me, especially when Mother Duck had baby ducklings on the go. I just loved those ducklings. I remember the day that my parents met my cousin Hugh for the very first time like it was yesterday, because it was so hilariously funny. My parents were so shocked, and I had to suppress my laughter because my mother looked like she would literally pass out with shock when she saw his bright pink dragon tail spiked hairstyle and all his tattoos, piercings, studs, along with the heavy makeup look. I think she was unable to digest what she was actually seeing, and gave me an earful later for not warning her about Hugh's punk rock appearance. "Why does he dress like that?" she asked me in astonishment. "In all my born days, I've never ever seen anything like it. I seriously nearly had a heart attack. This is my sister's son we're talking about. I would never have believed in a month of Sundays that this was possible. How extraordinary!" I'm not going to lie to you when I admit that I rather enjoyed shocking people when I introduced them to Cousin Hugh for the first time, because the reactions were incredibly hilarious, and all these years later I have to chuckle when I remember it all. One Sunday when I was attending church and my mother was suggesting that perhaps we left Hugh at home because the congregation might be a little shocked by his appearance. But I told my mother she was being utterly ridiculous. I remember we arrived at church 5 minutes late, and people were about to start singing when Hugh walked into the service. I will never forget the shocked heads that turned around to observe the strange, curious, colourful, spiky man taking a seat behind a pew next to me. I noticed the priest was so agog, he literally dropped his Bible on the ground. There were whispers, giggles, and furtive glances as people regarded Hugh like a strange, exotic specimen from a zoo. The people in the pews behind Hugh could not see a thing because his hairstyle was so high on his head that they couldn't see in front of themselves. I can remember the priest could not keep his eyes off Hugh because he had not ever seen anything like him before in his entire life, and he kept losing his place on the Bible passages. It was so funny. One day my mother and I went into the local town to buy some groceries, and Hugh decided to stay at home. This is his incredible story in his own words. "Hi, I'm Hugh, and yes, I was a punk rocker in London for many years, although I'm not anymore, and I was even personal friends with Boy George for a long while, and he was and is an exceptionally nice man, I might add. Being a punk for many years was a way of expressing myself and just letting go. I didn't want to conform to the establishment and the stereotypes of the day that clearly thought any self-respecting British man should be dressed conservatively in a suit and a pinstriped shirt. That was not for me. I didn't want to conform to worldly stereotypes or government ideals, and so I naturally rebelled against them. I think dressing the way I did was an art form. Instead of using brush, oils and canvas to express myself, I used my body as that canvas. I also enjoyed shocking people by being unconventional and different and not giving a hoot what people actually thought of me, which was very liberating, I might add. I was used to getting strange comments about my appearance, and never more so when I came to rural Kentucky. I heard a little girl saying, "Mummy, look at that funny man wearing a dragon's tail on his head." And I heard a little boy say, "Mummy, that man's wearing lots and lots of drawing pins on his body." So yes, I've had my fair share of eyeballing, whispering and giggles, but I enjoy being so interesting that people would actually want to talk about me. If I was a painting on the wall that people barely acknowledged, that would make it very mediocre. But if I possessed a painting that people talked about, either negatively or even positively, then I've engaged their attention in some way. As punk rockers, we have a saying, "I'd rather be ugly, 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 different, 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 beautiful, 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 but never plain, mediocre or nondescript, because in all honesty, there's nothing worse." As you can imagine, I ruffled a few feathers coming from the punk rock of Carnaby Street to the rural landscape of rural Kentucky, which incidentally I loved, and I will say that your America is utterly exquisite. It's a beautiful country indeed, and you need to treasure it and value it, 'cause she's lovely. Even though I grew up in London, I love the natural world. Not that I was well informed about it, but I was curious and eager to experience a ramble in the countryside, just as much as the next man would. On the day that Cousin Janice and Aunt Sue went to town, I decided to take a hike in the countryside, decked to the nines in my punk rock ensemble, which I naturally wore every day without fail. I was entering the wooded part of the land, and I was enjoying my country walk considerably, and the sound of the birdsong in the valley. But after a while the birdsong all but dissipated, which I thought was exceedingly odd. I then noticed this tree swaying backwards and forwards all on its own, and I got the very distinct impression that something or someone was actually watching me, and it really set my nerves on edge. I also could detect the strange rancid odour in the air that was pretty disgusting and smelt exactly like stale urine and cheesy trainers. Not that I'm any expert on smells. I could see the branch of this huge tree swaying backwards and forwards and backwards and forwards, and the tree was incredibly large. I wondered how it was conceivable that this tree could move like this without a heavy wind behind it. The feeling that someone was staring at me was very, very evident. And I get stared at a lot, so I always know when someone is actually scrutinising me, and normally I enjoy being stared at, but this time it felt really uncomfortable. I looked around and saw absolutely nothing, which didn't do any justice to me. I couldn't understand it. Suddenly I heard this long whistle that seemed to resonate over the valley. In truth, I thought it was a bird of some kind, and then this was followed by the sound of something or someone thumping a very large tree, about 6 times, making a sound ominously like thunder. The next thing I knew was I kept hearing whistles from all over the valley, coming from every part all at once. It was really bizarre. Then I began to hear these trees being banged from far away. It was very, very weird, and I was more curious than alarmed, because it felt like something very extraordinary was about to happen. Almost like the feeling you get when you realise the heavens are about to open and unload their hailstones upon you. It was that sort of anticipatory, expectant kind of feeling. Suddenly I heard this booming sound, and it sounded exactly like carriages with horses were reverberating through the woods at every angle, and they were thundering towards me. And then they just suddenly stopped, just like that. I saw trees everywhere, and I mean everywhere, not just isolated. Trees that were everywhere, moving backwards and forwards, and it felt like hundreds of eyes were staring upon me. All I knew is it was an airy, out-of-worldly feeling. The next thing I knew is that this creature jumped out of the undergrowth towards me. First one, then another, and another, and another, and I found myself being surrounded by dozens of creatures, the likes of such that I have never seen before. I was utterly dumbfounded, startled, and bedazzled. I didn't know what on earth to think. Should I be terrified, afraid, calm, or relaxed? What were these things, I wondered? These creatures were like huge humanoid giants. They were absolutely colossal in size and built like rhinos or elephants, as they were absolutely massive, very burly, densely thick and incredibly muscular. They were covered with long hazelnut hair, and they had long arms and human-like hands and feet. The creatures were all relatively similar in size, although the smallest was about 7 foot tall and the largest about 11 foot, and they would have weighed roughly between 8 to 1,000 pounds, and they were about 4 feet wide. I have no idea what these creatures actually were. I wish I did, but I didn't. And they proceeded to walk around me in a circle as if they were trying to work out what kind of species of human I actually was. They weren't at all aggressive about me, but instead rather fascinated and intrigued, and they were pointing to my hair and chatting away excitedly. One touched one of my pink spikes, and then they all did, one at a time, and they began to chatter away excitedly to each other, and it is like they were discussing me, intently. They were examining me for a long while. Even my makeup got their attention. And once again they chattered backwards and forwards, and the language they spoke was like that of a monkey, but it did seem like a language. In that moment I was too shocked to actually be scared. I kept thinking to myself, what the heck are these creatures? Because I've never seen anything like them before. I think my hairstyle baffled them immensely, because they thought it grew on my head like that. They had no idea how much craftsmanship was used to make my hair look so distinguished. After the creature had finished observing me, they all thundered back into the woods, galloping like horses, and then they were gone. Once they were gone, I seemed to get a delayed reaction and bolted back to the house as fast as I could, suddenly feeling a delayed sense of fear. It was like I suddenly realized that I'd been surrounded by very dangerous predators that could easily have killed me if they'd wanted to. For many long years I would wonder what on earth those critters were that I had encountered on my cousin's Kentucky farm. Sadly, I'm no longer a punk rocker anymore, as it was indeed one of the most exciting, adventurous times of my young life. But much like fashion, so do the eras change, as nothing ever stays constant or remains the same. As life always evolves, it changes and metamorphosizes into something else and something new. If you visit London today, the old Carnaby Street with its flamboyant punk rockers no longer exists, and you may wonder what happened to all those punk rockers. Their stories are probably much like mine. They literally are normal people today, just like you or me. I suppose we grew up, settled down, and no longer needed to dress in the way we did in those days. It took me ages to get my hair looking like that when I was young, and I doubt I would have the energy today to dye it again and stick it up like that. It was a long process. Nowadays, despite the eagle tattoos, I suppose I look relatively normal for a man of my age, and even the piercings have all but gone. But believe me, one thing that never changes is the memories. They most certainly are as real today as they were then. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Claudia, and I grew up in a small rural American town in the 90s, and my extraordinary Bigfoot encounter happened when I was about 12 years old. When I was 6 months old, I was legally adopted by my 2 parents, who literally longed to have a baby. My true biological mother was a heroin junkie who supported her addiction as an escort. After I was born, she literally threw me at social services and told them that she wanted nothing more to do with me. I cannot raise a kid on the street, she had said. I've never liked children anyway, so you can have her. I gather she signed some legal documents, and subsequently I was adopted by my delighted parents. From a very early age, my parents made no secret of the fact that I was actually adopted, and so I was given to understand that I did actually have 2 mothers, one that had birthed me and the other one who had raised me. It was a little confusing to understand at first, but the idea of having 2 mothers seemed really rather cool, as far as I was concerned. Growing up as a kid, I would boast to all my friends that I actually had 2 mothers, and I proudly informed them and promptly reminded them that they only had one, which they thought was terribly unfair. Why can I not have 2 mums like Claudia, my friends would complain to their parents. It's not fair. Invariably, when you're kids, 2 of anything was just so much better than 1. 2 candies was much more preferable than only 1, as was 2 Christmas stockings and 2 toys. For any kid, only having 1 of something always made you feel distinctly disadvantaged and very, very cheated. As Toby, one of the little boys I played with, so eloquently put it to his parents, with 2 mothers, Claudia can have 2 presents at Christmas, 2 holidays, and 2 Easter eggs. I want 2 mums, he would say. Claudia is so lucky. I gather his parents both believed that Toby would become a masterful accountant or banker one day, because he was so exemplary with numbers and mathematics, and could literally pick up any shortfalls and discrepancies at such a young age, and always knew immediately when he'd been cheated or hard done by, and was not having any of that, I can tell you. I grew up in a very charming, serene rural neighbourhood, and we lived on the edge of a recently tarmacked road, as attempts were being made to improve the dusty roads in the area. The contemporary elegant-looking houses on our street were all rather stylised and smart, with whitewashed walls and dark black slate roofs, large French windows and black front doors, as they'd all been designed by an up-and-coming swanky local architect who loved the accents of black and white exteriors that had seemingly become quite fashionable in the early 90s. Our pavements were exceedingly generous, with a large levelled expanse of perfectly manicured lawns that were dotted with a few recently planted young oaks. The voguish houses all possessed their own quintessential white wicker fence and gate, with a stone pathway that led to the front doors, and a driveway that led to a very smart black garage doors. It was obvious that the polished, rather dapper front yards were stylishly landscaped, with geometrically pruned hedges and stunning profusion of pretty white roses. Everyone on the street had unique, rather slick-looking backyards that varied from one neighbour to the next, which was rather nice, although we all did have exactly the same nifty-looking wooden porches and sumptuous entertainment areas. The houses that my parents and I actually lived in possessed a state-of-the-art modern-style swimming pool and a scattering of apple trees, along with beds of pretty flowers and home-grown vegetables that my mother was attempting to grow, that ranged from tomatoes, potatoes and pumpkins. The backyard overlooked beautiful pasture land, but in the distance you could see the quintessential rolling green emerald hills and mountainous valleys, so we did indeed overlook some enchanting and rather ravishing views. All the children in our street were rambunctious and noisy, and we were permitted to play together in the pavement and quiet, tranquil streets, which we did very often. One day when I was playing on the street, riding my little bicycle, a young woman with long blonde hair, wearing jeans and a rather jazzy white sweatshirt, adorned with sparkling diamante beads and an equally as glitzy denim jacket, approached me and my friend Candace and asked us our names. I told her my name was Claudia, and her face brightened and became animated and jubilant, and she gave me a huge big hug. I was almost certain I could see her wiping away tears, which I thought did seem rather emotionally intense for a stranger, but I enjoyed the attention that she was exhibiting towards me. I mean, what kid doesn't? "I'm an old friend of your mother's," she said. "You can call me Cat." "Ooh," I said. "I like cats." The lady laughed at my whimsical remark, which she seemed to find both endearing and amusing, and then she proceeded to give all of us kids candy, and told us not to tell our mothers because they might get very cross with her for giving us sweets. "You know what mummies and daddies are like. They never like you to have too much candy, because they worry about you getting rotten teeth. But I'm like the candy fairy," she proclaimed. "You can call me Candy Cat, because I give little well-behaved kids candies whenever they're good at keeping secrets." "My mummy never lets me have candy," said Candace, "so I'm not telling anyone about you." "Good girl," said Candy Cat. "That's what I want." It was not long before many of the kids would see Candy Cat on our street, and she was true to her word and would give us all lots of yummy sweets and doughnuts and other delectable, delightful, irresistible treats for kids of our age. True to our word, we never told our parents about her. As the mathematical Toby warned us wisely, if we tell our parents about Candy Cat, then we'll not get free candy any more. And so it made perfect sense not to tell our parents about the mystery blonde woman that visited us on our street and watched us in her car for seemingly ages, and then she would just drive off just like that. For the 5 of us kids, it was like a magical candy fairy had come to our neighbourhood, and we were not about to tell anyone about our good fortune, especially not our parents, because we knew that they would never approve, nor would they ever understand.
My mother always told me not to take candy from strangers, said Ruth. But Candy Cat's a fairy, and we can take candy from fairies because Mummy never ever told me that we couldn't take candy from fairies.
We all wholeheartedly agreed that Candy Cat could not be classified as an ordinary adult, so taking candy from her really didn't count at all. I wondered who she was, though, because she was so terribly nice and congenial. I did notice that although she had long, pretty blonde hair, she looked a little worn around the edges, almost as if she'd had rather a rough life. I noticed she wore a touch of makeup that did little to disguise the dark circles around her sparkling blue eyes, and her bronze, leathery skin seemed rather rough and worn, as if she'd suffered some setbacks in her life that had taken a notable toll on her body, robbing her of that quintessential youthful radiance that she clearly deserved. I really loved the fact that Candy Cat seemed so much more interested in me than all the other kids, which made me feel very exclusive and special. One day, when no one was looking, she surreptitiously gifted me with a beautiful Barbie doll. I couldn't believe it. I was so delighted. And she told me that it was our secret and not to tell anybody. I was so thrilled because I knew in that moment, without a doubt, that Candy Cat singled me out as her favourite, and that made me feel very, very special and favoured among the kids. When my mother discovered my brand new Barbie doll lying amongst my sizable toy collection, she asked me where I'd actually got it from, with a very perplexed look growing on her face. "I don't remember buying this for you." "Where did you get it from?" she asked. I told her that I couldn't remember, and she shook her head and said, "I must be losing my mind. I cannot remember buying you this Barbie. How very peculiar. You would think that I'd remember something like that. I do hope I'm not getting forgetful." As kids, we found it perfectly normal for Candy Cat to run and hide in her black Ford Escort if an adult started to call us. It would make us giggle, and we would tell Candy Cat to hide when an adult was coming. As kids, for us it was like playing hide and seek, and so it was a great deal of fun watching Candy Cat hide from our parents, and it became like a game to us. We would watch her ducking under the seat of the car parked opposite the road, which never raised any eyebrows because Cat's car was literally identical to our local pastor's, and he was always parking on the side of the road and inviting himself in for coffee with the residents. So seeing Cat's car parked on the opposite side of the road did not raise any objections or suspicions, as everybody just assumed that Pastor Mullaney was doing his spontaneous drop-ins. I do remember my mother saying, "Oh dear, Pastor Maloney, he's always parking on the opposite side of the road, rather too frequently of late. Oh, I do hope things are all right at home with him and his difficult wife. He doesn't have the easiest of marriages." One day Cat asked if we would like some ice creams, and all the kids were absolutely ecstatic about such an amazing proposal. I mean, what kid doesn't absolutely adore ice cream? "I need one of you kids to come with me to help me get the ice creams," she said, pointing to me. Naturally, I was delighted to be singled out. "Claudia, you come with me," she said, as she scribbled down all the orders of the ice cream flavours that the other kids wanted onto a piece of paper. I then went with Candy Cat to the ice cream parlour. Candy Cat gave the list of ice cream flavours to the man who regularly frequented our neighbourhood with his ice cream van. Candy Cat asked him to deliver the kids their prepaid ice cream flavours. She then proceeded to hand me my vanilla ice cream with a chocolate flake. "There you go. Isn't that yummy?" "Thank you, Candy Cat," I said, licking my ice cream happily and following her back to the car. "Come, let's go," she said. "We have a long journey ahead of us." As we were driving, Cat asked me all kinds of questions about my mother and about where I was born. I think she wanted to see what I knew. "I have 2 mothers," I told her, "so I'm very special." "Oh, you most certainly are," said Candy Cat. "And do you know that I'm your other mother?" I looked completely confused and baffled. "My mother told me that my real mum lives on the streets in a cardboard box." "That's right," laughed Candy Cat. "That was me. But I've cleaned my life up, and I don't live in a cardboard box anymore." Well, where do you live? I asked. Well, I'm going to show you now. I'm taking you there now, she laughed. And I've spoken to your mother about it, and she told me that you are more than welcome to spend a few days with your other mother. That's me, of course. But I said, I've never seen you talk to my mother before. You're always hiding from the adults in the street. I was only playing hide and seek, she laughed. But I did speak to your mother, she assured me, and she was very agreeable about you coming to stay with me. My face lit up because I was so surprised my mother was so willing to allow me to stay with lovely Candy Cat. I was really, really thrilled about this and spending time with Candy Cat because she was such a charming and delightful lady who was giving me so much attention. Why did my mother not want to say goodbye to me first? I asked her. And what about my clothes? Usually if I go away, I take clothes in a suitcase that Mummy packs for me. Cat squeezed my hand reassuringly. Your mother's a very busy lady these days. She doesn't have time to say goodbye to you, but she does send you lots and lots of love. And as far as your clothes are concerned, I've brought you a brand new wardrobe. I was surprised that Cat was describing my mother as a busy lady, because she certainly wasn't. She was a stay-at-home mum who wasn't too busy for me. But at only 8 years old, I willingly accepted that Cat was telling me the truth. Maybe my mother had become very busy all of a sudden, I thought. That was highly possible. I remember that drive so very well. We drove past exquisite meadows full of the most beautiful wildflowers you've ever seen, some with grazing cows or sheep, country barns, blueberry fields, and fields of corn. Where are we going? I asked. We're going home, said Cat. We're finally going home. It was not long before we were driving down a series of windy, very bumpy dirt roads, which caused the car to jigger and shake. And finally we took a sharp turning to the left, until we ended up parked at a large farm, heavy-grilled cattle gate. Candy Cat got out of the car to open the gate, and then proceeded to get back into the car. And then we drove down this long dirt road that was surrounded on either side with vast areas of natural meadows. One of the meadows was literally full of black and white dotted grazing cows that looked up at us curiously as we drove by while they chewed their cud. We drove towards a huge, traditional, pristine-looking white double-storey New England-style farmhouse with a Dutch-style front door. I looked at Candy in awe. You live here? I asked. Oh, no, I don't, she said. No, not there. This is Farmer Armstrong's home, she assured me. At that moment an elderly man came racing out of the house with a broad beam on his face. He had a long white beard, bright blue twinkling eyes, and a rather weathered-looking sun-damaged wrinkled skin. Candy Cat rolled down her window. So you finally got here, said the man, smiling and looking at me with a broad grin on his face. You must be Claudia, he said. I'm very pleased to meet you, Claudia. I'm sure that I shall be seeing a great deal of you. He then handed Candy Cat some keys. Those are for the trailer home. Good luck. Thanks, said Candy Cat, getting back into her car with a big smile. Poor Mr. Armstrong, she told me. He's a very, very sad and lonely man, because he lost his wife to cancer over 5 years ago. He's kindly allowing me to live on his land in his beautiful trailer home his late wife designed. He'll be coming to visit us very regularly, but when he visits you must go and play outside, because Mr. Armstrong likes to talk in privacy. He gets very lonely. Do you understand? I nodded. He must be very sad. Finally we came to the trailer home that was parked in an open clearing in the middle of a pretty wild meadow, flanked on one side by a dense forest full of Douglas maples, big-leaf maples, Pacific silver firs, and red alder trees, and a few oak trees at that. The trailer home was in pristine condition, painted in white with green windows and a green roof. It was really snazzy and contemporary, and I was amazed. I didn't think trailer homes could ever be cosy, but this was absolutely gorgeous, as if an interior designer with superb taste had refurbished the trailer into a work of fine art, using bright, colourful Moroccan colour schemes and cosy, sumptuous furnishings. My bedroom was very chic and tasteful, and Candy Cat had transformed it into a princess den with pretty pink decor and boxes full of the most amazing toys, including a large princess chariot bed. It really didn't get better than that. I knew that the next few days were going to be exciting, and I really couldn't wait to tell my parents about my wonderful adventure with my other mother. I knew Toby would be so jealous of me if he knew that Candy Cat, the Candy Fairy, was in fact my mother. I could easily imagine the envious expression on his face as he calculated the mathematical advantages to having a second mother. The thought made me giggle. Fast forward to several weeks, and I was now living with Candy Cat in her trailer, and had been sadly informed that my poor mother and father were not very well, and I needed to stay with Candy Cat for a little longer, which was very upsetting because I missed my parents terribly. Before long, it would seem like days drifted into weeks, and weeks into months, and months into years. It's amazing how fast time flies. Candy Cat was homeschooling me, and so I did not have much contact with other kids, and I missed my friends from the street. Apart from Kyle and Sylvia, of course, who came to stay with their grandfather on the weekends, so then I had kids to play with, and they were fun. Farmer Armstrong came to visit regularly, and Candy Cat would lock her bedroom door when he came, and they would be there for ages, talking, chatting, giggling and laughing. When he came out of the bedroom, he always gave Candy Cat heaps of cash, and he often brought me candies and presents. Sometimes Candy Cat would drink way too much or smoke a little weed on the side, but she did tell me that Farmer Armstrong had paid for her drug rehabilitation, and that she had used to be addicted to the very heavy stuff, like meth and heroin. But knowing she had a daughter had made her very desirous to get clean, and all the hard work had finally paid off, although it had been a horrendous struggle for her. You would think I'd get bored on this farm, but I loved getting involved with the workings of a dairy farm, and I helped Farmer Armstrong raise a couple of calves on bottles of their mother's milk, which was an amazing experience for me. I also enjoyed helping Farmer Armstrong in the dairy with the cows. I adored playing with his two beautiful young dogs, a golden Labrador called Max and a golden retriever called Cloudy, whom I would walk regularly around the farm. Farmer Armstrong said that they needed lots and lots of exercise because recently it would seem that Cloudy had been piling on loads and loads of weight, despite her reduced calorie diet. I am told, he told me, that golden retrievers can get very fat very easily, he would tell me, and unfortunately Cloudy here is predisposed to weight gain, unless someone has been sneaking her a few little snacks from side to side, he said, looking at me teasingly. Oh no, I haven't, I said. I've never given Cloudy any treats. But Farmer Brown didn't look too convinced. There was an enchanting gushing stream that meandered through the woods, and it was my favourite spot to frequent. I would sit on the flattened rocky boulders for ages and ages and throw stones. I often wondered if I would ever hear from my parents again, because Candy Cat had told me that they were now seriously ill, and I kept praying in my heart that they would get better. But with the passing of time, the memory of my parents had faded quite considerably, because 4 years is a long time. One day when I entered the woods, I felt something was very different, and I didn't know what it was. It was like the woods had become very, very quiet and still, and the cheerful bird calls had all but dissipated. I noticed that there was a funky smell in the woods that was so unpleasant it actually caused me to feel quite sick. What was it, I wondered? Was there a dead animal lying around? I started to search for the source of the smell, but I found absolutely nothing. I proceeded to sit on a rocky outcrop beside the stream, and I lowered my body over the gushing water and placed a couple of beautiful paper boats that I had created into the jetting water, and I watched them gliding off in the strong current. Sometimes they would become stranded on a rock, but after a second or so the fast-moving pace of the water would propel them forwards and onwards further down the stream. It was always fun to play with paper boats. Suddenly I found myself being pelted with by little stones, almost as if something or someone was trying to get my attention. But when I turned around to look for the source of the culprit, there was no one there. I noticed that a branch was swaying, and I got the very distinct impression that someone was clearly watching me. But who, I couldn't imagine. I could see this gargantuan dark shadow moving through the undergrowth, and then I became convinced that I was being stalked by a bear. I knew I needed immediately to get out of the woods, as fast as I could, because I did not want to encounter this black bear face to face. It was too late, because the black bear had seen me, and was clearly running after me. My heart began to pound violently in my chest, and my hair was standing on end, and it was hard to run because my legs felt like cement. I knew that I was not supposed to run from a black bear, but for some reason I couldn't help myself, and I began to sprint as fast as I possibly could, with the hefty bear in eager pursuit of me. I knew that I was in very grave danger, and terror engulfed every fibre of my being, and I knew quite literally that my life hung in the balance. I needed to run even faster. Suddenly I could hear the heavy breathing getting very close, and the snorting of the creature that sounded remarkably like a horse. And with effortless ease it pounced on me and held my shoulder down with its huge paw. In a moment of absolute terror, I glanced down at my shoulder, only to discover that the paw was not a paw at all, but a huge human-like hand, with fingers that were literally the size of sausages, and a very smooth nail bed, very much like a human's. This was no bear, I thought, but the hands were not completely human either. They were massive in size. I turned around in absolute horror to find myself staring into these eyes of a huge humanoid ape. I was about to scream in absolute terror because this colossal being was so intimidating, impressive and powerful, it quite literally felt like I was standing in the presence of a deadly, frightening predator. Yet it was the assiduous, zealous expression on the creature's face that suppressed my screams. I knew immediately that she had no intention of hurting me, and I sensed that she was trying to tell me something very significant and important, but what I could not imagine. And why was she consulting me, I wondered, in the first place? It was decidedly odd. I could tell she was female because she kept pointing to her hairy breasts, which she seemed to think I would find a source of great fascination for some bizarre reason. Well, that's what I thought at the time, but now I know differently. She then proceeded to pull her nipples and squeeze them, and of course they were dry. Why was she trying to tell me that, I wondered? I knew she needed my help. I sensed that immediately. I studied her curiously, and my fear was hijacked by awe and admiration, because I'd never seen such an incredible creature like this before. What was she, I wondered? Half human and half ape, I decided. I didn't know a creature like this even existed in North America, and I was bedazzled and beguiled by her. I would say she was about 9 foot tall, 800 pounds and 4 feet wide, and she was covered in long, beautiful shaggy auburn hair, similar to the colour of a red setter dog. She was powerful, athletic, strong, majestic and lofty, and her body was so ripped with muscle, much like a world-class athlete who spent every waking moment in the gym and ate copious amounts of eggs and chicken to maintain his ample bulk. For this creature she was just a masterful athlete without all the workouts, as it was clearly ordained in her genealogy. That was clear to see. The creature had a beautiful hairless face with a salmon-coloured leathery skin, a flat nose that rather reminded me of a pug, a very prominent brow ridge, and sparkling bright brown rusty-coloured eyes that seemed congenial and warm. And to my relief, I really did believe she didn't mean me any harm. The creature beckoned me to follow her with her overlong arms. I followed her a little cautiously, not knowing what it was she wanted me to see. I did feel rather reluctant, I'm not going to lie. Could she be pretending to be nice and then suddenly pounce on me and devour my flesh, I wondered in horror. I followed her as I sensed her profound earnestness. Suddenly she was pointing to 8 white fluffy puppies lying cuddled together beneath a large oak tree. They were so tiny with their eyes all closed, and they were lying in a large deerskin pelt, and the creature handed them to me in the pelt, scrunched up like a bag, and then she pointed towards the farmhouse. Suddenly I realised in that moment what she was trying to tell me, that these little adorable pieces of white fluff were Cloudy's puppies, because they looked like miniature versions of her. They were adorable, cute, fluffy and sweet, but they were clearly hungry. It all made perfect sense now. Cloudy had recently gained so much weight. But why had she abandoned her puppies like this, I wondered in horror. That seemed so incongruous for a dog like her, for she was such a loving, devoted and kind-hearted animal. It didn't make any sense to me at all. Animals were naturally good mothers. I took the bag from the creature and I touched her with my hand, as a way to say thank you. I think she understood, but I really got the distinct impression that she was an elusive creature that would rather have remained in the shadows than engaged with humans at all. So it must have been her maternal drive that made her overcome her reticence and led me to the puppies. I ran towards the farmhouse very hurriedly, knowing that time was of paramount importance, because these puppies urgently needed their mother's milk, and very fast. They were ravenously hungry and potentially could die if they didn't get help almost immediately. Some of them were already showing signs of weakness and lethargy. I could sense the creature's ardent eyes on me. She clearly wanted me to get help for the puppies as much as I suddenly did. Cloudy was lying on Farmer Armstrong's kitchen floor and seemed to look a little out of sorts and really rather depressed and sorry for herself. I suddenly put the puppies at her teats, and they immediately started to suckle, pushing their little paws against the teats and extracting as much milk as conceivably possible, clearly making up for the calorie deficit. And the amazing thing was that Cloudy seemed deliriously happy all of a sudden. She was so glad to be reunited with her little young ones, and she was licking and fondling her puppies with her long tongue. I think she was very glad to be reunited with her long-lost children. When Farmer Armstrong entered his kitchen, his face was agog, and he was utterly amazed. "Oh, my word," he said to me. "I knew I'd overlooked something, but I couldn't imagine what it was. I fully intended to get Cloudy and Max snipped at the vet's, but I forgot. And I kept blaming Cloudy for being fat, and you for feeding her titbits, and I was completely wrong about that. I must apologise. Poor little Cloudy. She's almost a puppy herself, and she's looking after her little uns just like a pro." After he said that to me, I didn't have the heart to tell him that Cloudy had initially abandoned her puppies from the woods. I now believe she might have done that because initially she didn't know what was happening to her body, because she was such a young dog. Or maybe she got a glance of the hairy humanoid in the woods and fled because she was terribly afraid. I can't blame her for that. Fast forward a few weeks and the police arrived at our trailer unexpectedly, and they arrested my mother due to a tip-off they received from someone. They took her away in handcuffs. I was then taken to my adopted parents, whom I had not seen for 4 years. It turned out that after my real mother got clean from drugs and knew that she had legally signed me over to my adopted parents, she decided that the only course of action was to kidnap me because she wanted to raise me herself. I begged my adopted parents not to file charges against my real mother, and they didn't, but she still had to serve a very light sentence. From that moment on, I continued to live with my adopted parents, whom had been distraught about my disappearance, even though they knew that I had been kidnapped by my real mother, because the kids had told her all about the lady in blonde who had given sweets to us. My parents were very forgiving towards my mother, and agreed for me to spend the odd weekend on Mr. Armstrong's dairy farm. In about 2001, Candy Cat eventually married Mr. Armstrong, and they were very happy together. I'd been away from my real home for 4 years, and so being reunited with my family was amazing, because I loved them so much. And the best news of all was that they had never been sick, but I had got that impression because that's what Candy Cat had cleverly told me, to keep me from asking too many questions. I ended up having an amazing childhood, with 2 mothers and one of Cloudy's puppies, a dog called Madison, whom became the most incredible dog I've ever known. She even rescued a child that was drowning once. As for the mysterious hairy humanoid, I now know that creature was Bigfoot, and I'm so incredibly grateful that this creature had the percipience to get me to help her rescue those precious puppies that brought so much joy to so many families who are completely oblivious in the knowledge that a Bigfoot touched their lives in a magic way because they have one of Cloudy's puppies. So there you are. That's my story. Dear Sarah, and all your lovely listeners, my name is Arabella, and I grew up in Seattle in a very attractive neighbourhood with my parents and 2 boisterous sisters in the early 80s. My sisters were very rambunctious and rather wild growing up, and sometimes they behaved more like boys than like little girls. They would climb trees and tear around the neighbourhood on their bicycles. Of course, I played with my sisters all the time, but I was the only one that never climbed the trees, and was much more careful riding my bike around the neighbourhood lest I should fall or hurt myself. I was relentlessly teased about how feminine I was because I adored everything beautiful, from flowers to animals and exquisite beautiful views. And I loved all the finer things in life, like the creature comforts and modern luxuries. I also adored baking and cooking, and from an early age my family was spoiled by my aspiring culinary prowess, as I was always turning out exquisite cakes and delicious meals, even if I say so myself. My sister Amanda would always tease me relentlessly and say that the man that I one day married would become so fat, like a huge whale, because I would spoil and feed him up so much that he would be bouncing around the place like a large beach ball. Everyone heartily agreed, and thought the prospect of my marrying a man that ballooned so much that he finally morphed into a gargantuan blue whale was terribly funny. My father was an exceedingly brilliant, clever man, who worked in the banking world and was remarkably successful and affluent, while my avant-garde mother was very controversial, artistic, feisty, and exceedingly dramatic. She revelled in the world of art, and loved nothing better than to shock people and cause a stir by saying the most outlandish, outrageous things that would always get strange reactions. I remember her being a terrible flirt when it came to other men. My father was never bothered about my mother's coquettish behaviour, because he knew that it was completely harmless and would never lead to anything, because my mother was so committed to her marriage and loved the bones of my father. She just could not help her public displays of outrageous, provocative flirting. That was just something that was part of the way she was. There were times my parents would have the most dramatic fights that would put the dramas on television like Dallas to shame. Those film producers could have taken some lessons of drama from the antics of my mother and dad, and they would have learnt a thing or two, let me tell you. I remember one day my mother barged out of the house shouting, "I'm leaving you, Peter, for good!" And she stormed out of the house and drove her car to the nearest movie theatre. My father knew exactly where she'd going, and so he got a taxi to the movie theatre and took with him my mother's spare set of car keys and drove her car back home. He then proceeded to drive his car to the movie theatre, and he waited for her in the car park. And when my mother came out after the film had finished, he described her coming out of the theatre looking very perturbed and incredibly shocked because she could not find her car anywhere. My father drove up to her, pulled down the window and said, "Sally, dear, would you like a lift?" Finally, she got into the car with a very sulky look on her face. She really did not like to get caught out like this. Growing up, we always had bulldogs, and I mean English bulldogs, because my father adored the breed. They had lovely flat pug-like faces, and he would walk them every single day. The trouble is, they never wanted to come back home, and you literally had to drag them. One thing about bulldogs, if you know anything about them, they're exceedingly stubborn. One day our oversized bulldog called Tweed parked herself literally in the middle of the road and simply refused to budge even an inch. I was with my father at the time, and I was coaxing and encouraging and pulling her with the lead, but it was to no avail. It was not long before Tweed had literally caused a huge traffic congestion in our road and a pile-up of traffic with about 40 cars, one behind the other, many becoming impatient. "What's holding up the traffic?" shouted one man a couple of cars down. "It's a bulldog," shouted another. She's simply refusing to budge from the middle of the road." Finally, someone with a wheelbarrow from a neighbouring home came to our rescue, and we managed to evacuate our bulldog by plunging her into the wheelbarrow and wheeling her home. She looked very pleased with herself to be getting a lift and not to have to walk. Tweed seemed to enjoy the strange transportation home, and she had a look of absolute jubilation on her face. Everyone in the car started to clap, applaud, and literally whistle. There was even an article in the paper written about Tweed, and it read the following: "Tweed, a white, very hefty bulldog with a very stubborn disposition, did not want to return home after her morning walk with owner Mr. Peter Harrington. It would seem that the large white bulldog had other ideas and decided that a nap in the middle of a busy Seattle road early in the morning was clearly a great idea. Despite the best efforts to coax Tweed away and to move her across the road, it was to no avail. She simply would not budge. As a result, this English bulldog caused major hold-ups and traffic congestion, much to the delight of all the drivers. Tweed was then evacuated to her home by being forcefully removed in a wheelbarrow. Driver Rick Martin described the scene as, "It made my day. I have never laughed so much in my entire life. That Tweed was such a character. I think we should take a leaf out of Tweed's book and remember that life is not about rushing all the time." So Tweed really made an impact on so many people's lives. When I was very young, I would love nothing better than our family trips to Bloomingdale's, and the cosmetic department with its bright lights and beautiful counters was simply like eye candy for me. I was in utter awe of the exclusive cosmetic houses from Christian Dior to Lancôme and Yves Saint Laurent. I thought the elegant, swanky women behind those counters were stunningly beautiful and very snazzy. I wanted to be exactly like them when I grew up. When I was older, I qualified as a beauty therapist, and one day I found myself working behind a cosmetic counter in Bloomingdale's, and I never ever looked back. I was so passionate about serving my customers and examining their skin, giving them cosmetic and makeup advice, and I adored my job and was extremely successful. I worked for about 3 prestigious cosmetic companies, including Lancôme and Christian Dior, and it was a wonderful, memorable and very special time in my life. One day all the cosmetic girls got together for a Christmas dinner in an upmarket stylish restaurant in Seattle, and those who were married brought along their partners as well. That was when I first met him. He was strikingly handsome and very, very charming, and he couldn't keep his eyes off me. There was only one problem, and that was he was married to one of the cosmetic girls at Bloomingdale's. I knew that I was not the kind of girl who would ever date a married man, and so I never gave him a second, even fleeting thought. Several months later, I was in a bookstore looking at some books when I was approached by a handsome man that I'd met once at the Christmas party. His name was Andre, and he asked me if I remembered him. "Of course," I said. "I remember you from the cosmetic Christmas party." We started to engage in a conversation when he surreptitiously let slip that he was now officially divorced from his wife, and he wasted no time in asking me out for dinner. In truth, I was in 2 minds about whether to accept a date from a divorcee or not, and also someone who had been previously married to one of the cosmetic girls I worked with at Bloomingdale's. I wondered if dating an ex-husband was the wise thing to do, given the sensitivity of the circumstances, but in the end I could not resist the lure of his beguiling, bedazzling and seductive charms. I did, however, tell Andre's ex-wife that I had accepted a date from her husband, and hoped that she didn't mind. I just didn't want her to find out that I was surreptitiously dating him behind her back. "You are welcome to date him," she told me, "but I do need to warn you that he's very intense and exceedingly possessive, and he doesn't take kindly to rejection." I was not sure what she meant by what she said, but I wasn't concerned either, because I was very attracted to Andre at the time, and there was an undeniable spark and chemistry between us, and so I suppose I just dived right into the deep end, so to speak. It was not long before I started dating Andre regularly, and he showered me with expensive presents such as flowers and chocolates, and he quite literally swept me off my feet. Naturally, I loved all the attentive devotion, but after a while alarm bells started ringing in my head. I noticed that he was becoming exceedingly possessive over me, and that made me very, very uncomfortable. One day in a restaurant, as we were enjoying our seafood dinner together, Andre noticed a gentleman glancing at me with an approving look on his face, and he stormed over to the table and literally threatened the man. "You keep your eyes off my girl," he snapped. I knew immediately that I had big problems, and over time Andre became more and more possessive and very aggressive towards any man that showed me the slightest bit of interest that could be a potential threat to his relationship with me. One day in a restaurant in Seattle, I literally told Andre that our relationship was finished, that we needed to end it, and I told him it was because it wasn't working. Andre did not say a word. For a long while he sat there in silence, but his face went blood red, and he was expressionless, but I could sense he was fuming. He paid the bill, and we retreated back to the car, and then he drove to a quiet area. I remember thinking that he just wanted to talk, but to my amazement he pulled out his gun and asked me to climb into his boot. "Andre," I said, "don't be so silly. Let's talk about this." I could tell Andre was serious because his brown eyes looked enraged. "Get into the boot," he screamed. "Get into the boot now, or I'll shoot you." I promptly obeyed because he was holding his gun to my head, and I sensed he meant business. I'm not sure how long I was in the back of that boot, or where Andre was taking me. I did try to get out of the boot, but there was no way out. It was locked. My heart was pounding, and my thoughts were racing, as I literally tried to figure out how was the best way to get out of this precarious situation that I found myself in. Perhaps I should pretend that I didn't want to break up with him after all, but I wasn't sure if I could successfully pull the wool over his eyes. I knew Andre was not a stupid person and would not be easily fooled. I do not know how long I lay cooped up in the back of that boot, but it did seem like an age. And yet it was so dark and claustrophobic, being in such a confined, horrible space. I could feel the wheel of the cars riding over this bumpy terrain and gravel, and I could feel that they were dirt roads, so I knew we were in the countryside somewhere. Finally, Andre opened the boot. "You can get out now," he said, holding the gun to my head. "We're in the middle of nowhere," he said. "There is not a solitary soul or house for miles, and so you can scream all you like, because no one will hear you." "Why are you doing this, Andre?" I asked. "Why can we not talk about things like civilized adults?" "There is nothing to talk about," snapped Andre. "You made your position very clear. You have decided you want to end things with us, and you barely know me. You've not even given me a chance to persuade you that I am the one for you." "Are there no other ways to persuade me than stuff me in a boot and threaten me with a gun? Surely we can work things out," I said. "Stop talking," snapped Andre, "and follow me to the trailer over there." He was pointing his gun at me, but I knew trying to run would be absolutely futile. He would definitely catch me, and besides, where would I run to? And I was in the middle of nowhere. There was really no point. The trailer was indeed very large and was lavishly decorated with a very comfortable furnishings and looked like a cosy, sumptuous den. And the kitchen cabinets were incredibly well stocked, with tins, juices, long-life milk and freeze-dried food, and there was also a gas energy supply. It was almost as if Andre had prepared himself for every eventuality, and indeed living off-grid, and being out of town for a while. "I have given so much up for you," he said, as he ordered me to sit down at the kitchen table and proceeded to pour me a juice. "I ended my marriage for you," he continued. "When I saw you at that Christmas party, I knew I had to have you. And now this is how you repay me," he said, kicking the chair violently. "If I cannot have you, no one can," he said. "Do you know what I mean by that?" "No," I stammered. "What do you mean?" "It'll be lights out," he said, "for me and for you," he said, cocking his rifle to his head. "If I cannot have you in life, I will indeed have you in death, and it's as simple and straightforward as that. I'm not giving up on us. I believe in us. You're all I've ever wanted and desired, and now you're treating me like the turd on your shoe. Is that fair? Now I ask you again, is that fair?" he shouted. "No, it's not," I said. "No, it's not." All the while we talked, I realised that Andre was completely mad, and that he was willing to shoot us both dead if I didn't agree to this relationship. I started stringing him along to try and reassure him that he was indeed the one for me, and that I was falling in love with him, but I could tell he was not convinced by my act. "How do I know that you're telling me the truth?" he said. "You could be saying anything to lull me into a false sense of security." For a long time we just chatted and chatted, but it seemed that I failed to persuade him that I wanted to continue with our relationship. I think he sensed I wasn't telling him what he wanted to hear, and he was not buying any of it. I spent several days in the trailer going over our relationship again and again with a fine-tooth comb, trying to persuade and convince him that I was crazy about him. But luckily our relationship was not physical at this stage, and so he wasn't crossing those boundaries, because despite everything, amazingly enough, he actually did respect me. One day Andre, who'd been drinking copious amounts of coffee to stay awake over the last few days, in order to make sure I did not make a hasty escape. However, soon it would seem that emotional and physical exhaustion literally got the better of him, and suddenly he fell fast asleep with his head on the kitchen table. I thought this would be the perfect opportunity to escape. The trouble was I was literally in the middle of nowhere, without any clue as to where I was geographically. I had thought of escaping many, many times, but I knew it would be infinitely more preferable to talk Andre around, but that was clearly not working. The thought of escaping was so overwhelmingly daunting for me because I had absolutely no idea where on earth to go. And the idea of running through a vast wooded area that stretched back for literally miles scared the living daylights out of me. I'm not going to kid. There were all kinds of considerations to take into account, like Andre chasing after me and shooting at me at point-blank range, which was not impossible given his mental state. Then, of course, there was the fact that it was very daunting to be running around in an area where I had no clue where I was. And then getting lost in the woods, or being devoured by a dangerous wild animal. I would not describe myself as a courageous person by any manner of means, but I knew I had to get out of this situation and fast before things turned very ugly and violent. I could not escape in his car because his car keys were worn over his neck like a necklace, and his gun was tucked in his gun holty, and I knew it would be absolutely impossible to take them off him without disturbing him and waking him up. That just could not happen. Luckily, Andre had not locked the trailer door, because I guess he knew I had nowhere to run anyway, and was pretty confident that I was too cowardly to escape from such a remote area, and normally he would be right, but not on this occasion. He had assured me that if I tried to run away, I literally could be ravaged by a mountain lion or a team of coyotes, and was convinced, I was actually convinced that he was right about that. Before I knew it, I was out of the trailer in the afternoon sun and running for my life as fast as I possibly could towards the woods. And once I entered the woods, I just kept moving forwards and forwards without really knowing where on earth I was going. I really felt like a rabbit in a maze, as there were tall, majestic trees everywhere, and in this woody wilderness I felt incredibly vulnerable and afraid. I just thought if I ran in a straight line, that eventually the woods would end on the side of a road, and hopefully I'd be able to flag down someone in a passing car. I just wanted to believe with all my heart that that would be the case, and so I kept visualizing that road in my mind and believing with every part of my being that I would invariably find it. Fortunately, I was wearing long black pants and shoes, which offered me a little protection from the thorny briars and poison ivy that I encountered. Luckily, the wooded area was not too overgrown, and I could run through it relatively easily. As I ran, I had a few hair-raising moments, especially when I surprised a mother deer and her fawn, who scuttled off quickly, looking at me with surprise, as if I was the last thing they ever expected to encounter. I noticed squirrels darting up trees and nibbling acorns, eyeing me with a reverent curiosity. I also observed rabbits darting in their burrows, and it seemed that the forest was just teeming with wildlife, and I certainly got the impression that none of these animals had encountered humans many times before. I noticed the woods were exquisitely beautiful, and the birdsong was breathtakingly enchanting, and the shafts of sunlight danced through the woods and illuminated the ferns and shrubbery on the forest floor with a soft, white, pretty light. When you're afraid, it is amazing how much better you can run, because I have never run as fast as I did on this occasion. I was sweaty, filthy, dirty, clammy, and bleeding in places on my face and hands from the dagger-like sharp thorns that had pierced my skin, but truly I didn't care. All that mattered was escaping and getting away from Andre. Yet despite all of these negative influences, I continued to have an insatiable desire to overcome the obstacle of this large, seemingly impenetrable forest. I was certain that Andre would be hot on my trail by now, and I knew that speed was of the utmost essence. Suddenly I heard the ominous rumble of thunder, and I realized that I was about to be caught up in a heavy rainstorm, and suddenly the skies just opened, and the rain pelted down, and there was yellowed lightning flashing across the sky. I was becoming soaked and drenched to the skin, and was totally soaked, and I began to shiver and shake because I was feeling very cold. It seemed that there was nowhere that I could take cover. Even the large trees were not preventing the rain from saturating my clothes with water. I was so terrified of the inevitable threat of actually being struck by lightning. It was bad enough trying to escape from Andre, but I could have picked a better day for my escape than this. It was just my rotten luck to get caught up in this horrendous storm. It could only happen to me, I thought. I know it sounds absolutely pathetic and childish, but I just fell onto my knees in the rain, and I began to sob and sob and sob. I was so drenched to the skin in rain. I was emotionally exhausted and physically drained, and literally soaked to the skin like a drowned rat. The next thing I knew was that I was being lifted up into the air and thrown over this large pair of shoulders, and I was too shocked and amazed to scream, because what was happening was so surreal. It was almost like I had to pinch myself to actually believe that this was happening. At first I thought I'd been grabbed by a bear, but I could see that the creature had human-like hands and feet that made me relax a little bit more. The hairy critter ran with me so very fast, and before I knew it, I found myself in a very large cave in a rocky outcrop in a wooded clearing, and I was being placed on the ground by a very strange-looking creature, the likes of such that I have never ever seen before. I was so relieved to be out of the rain, but I realised that this curious critter was not a loner, but there were 3 others exactly like herself in this large cave, taking cover. I'm a very shy person by nature, but when the large creature indicated for me to take off my clothes, I did so unhesitantly. I did not feel self-conscious in front of these critters, as I would have indeed in front of humans. The female creature who had rescued me proceeded to hand me a huge animal pelt, which I wrapped around my body very gratefully. I could sense she was trying to help me, and I watched her hanging up my drenched clothes in the cave to dry. I could see that the cave was covered in animal pelts that literally carpeted the entire floor like a thick carpet, so it was very comfortable sitting on the ground, even though it did smell a little funky. The creatures were all very tall, but the tallest must have been about 10 foot, and the shortest I would say was about 3 foot and under 100 pounds. They were covered from head to toe with long brownish red hair. They looked so human-like it was almost uncanny, and it was this humanness that I could see in them that made me feel that I was relatable to these creatures. Like, for example, zebras and horses in a field together. Although they're both different, they can sense their commonality. At least I think they can. I will admit that next to these creatures, I did feel like a fragile, delicate and tiny doll by contrast, because they were burly, thick and powerfully strong. As I was sitting on the floor waiting for the rain to stop, the creatures were incredibly kind to me and showed me no sign of aggression whatsoever, nor did I believe for a single moment that they were keeping me against my will. The little creature was so incredibly affectionate and came up to me and stood over my hair, playing with it and twisting it in his thick hands, and it was like he was looking for nits. It really was quite amusing. It also felt like he was giving me the most amazing head massage because his fingers were so very firm and big and strong, and although young and small, he was powerful. The little critter was the friendliest of all the creatures, who were all a little shy and reticent, especially the large male, who looked at me a little warily and apprehensively, and possibly was not too convinced it was a great idea my sharing the cave with him and his family. After a while he physically relaxed as he watched me engaging and playing happily with his little son in the cave. One of the games we played is this little critter would get me to shut my eyes, and then he would pass me an acorn, and I was expected to feel it, examine it, and then put it back in the pile of acorns. When I opened my eyes and pointed to the acorn he had given me, invariably I always got it wrong. You see, I had to guess which the correct acorn was. Every time I got it wrong, the little critter was utterly delighted and enthralled, and before long all the critters were playing the game with me. I think they found it hard to believe that anyone could be so terrible and pathetic at a game, and not only did they find that amusing, they also enjoyed winning. They were brilliant at the game because they could tell and feel the difference with every acorn that they picked up with their fingers, and they knew which one was which. The rain came down heavily all night, and I was so utterly exhausted I fell into a deep sleep on the skin floor. And when I woke up in the morning, I was amazed how light and bright it actually was. I immediately put my clothes on that I'm glad to say had dried overnight. The creatures were all sitting, watching and observing me, wondering what I was going to do next. But the little one dashed towards me, rubbing his affectionate head against my shoulders, and I ruffled the hair on his head. I pointed to the outside of the cave, indicating to the creatures that I wanted to go now, and they seemed to understand what I was saying. Then I suddenly had a magnificent idea. I immediately pulled away the deerskin rug to draw with a stick on the dirt floor what I wanted to impress upon the creatures, so they gathered around me to watch what I was doing. I proceeded to draw the forest trees, then I drew a road and cars, and I pointed to myself and the road, trying to get through to them that was where I wanted to go. I couldn't believe it that the creatures actually understood what I was trying to say, and the male proceeded to draw what I had drawn, and then I nodded, and he understood completely what I was saying to him. So he escorted me out of the cave, and then I began to walk next to him. I was so slow that he finally shook his head in disapproval and squatted on his legs and pointed to his shoulders, and I got on to the top of him, and he literally ran through that forest with me on his back at such a fast pace. He was as fast as a cheetah. It was hard to fathom that anything could run like this, and I truly enjoyed riding him far better than any horse that I've ridden in the past, because he was so agile and strong, and I felt incredibly safe. Suddenly the forest ended, and there I was on the side of a very dirt road, and I thought the creature would go, but believe it or not, he was so courteous that he actually waited for me. It was an hour or so before someone came driving down the dirt road, and I finally waved the car down, and finally got help. The creature watched me behind the tree, taking care not to be observed by the human driver, and then he galloped to the woods. Fast forward a few weeks, and I returned home to find that Andre had returned to Seattle and actually shot himself in the head at point-blank range. He had phoned his ex-wife and told her that I had left him and he couldn't live without me. It was all desperately sad, but I didn't go to the police to file abduction charges because what was the point? He was already dead. I also did not want to sour the precious memory his family may have had of him, because that would be a dreadful thing to do, given their inevitable grief that they were facing. For a while I did blame myself for what actually happened to Andre, but I realized that it couldn't be my fault. I now know years later that that creature that I encountered in the wood, and all those 3 creatures, were in fact Bigfoots, and I believe the female witnessed my sorry state and rescued me from the rain. I think she felt compassionate towards me. I fell in love with the little one, and I would have gladly taken him home with me in a heartbeat. But that would never have been possible, nor would it have ever been wise. Even when I share a cave with Bigfoots, I learnt that they are indeed private, very elusive creatures, and they hate to have their space invaded. It took a while for the big creature to finally warm up to me. I will say this, and that is that they are remarkably intelligent, discerning and perceptive creatures, and I believe they will help people in dire situations, as they most certainly helped me. Dear Sarah and all your lovely listeners, my name is Pippa, and I grew up in Oregon in a very picturesque and exquisite part of the world, on 70 acres of land in the 90s. Our enchantingly nostalgic-looking home has been in the family line since the 1800s and has been fortunately passed down from one generation to the next. Our exquisite property boasts 3 beautiful ponds and a delightful creek surrounded by majestic tall, towering silver fir, grand fir, beech, pine, sequoia and maple trees that create an extensive wooded area on our land, forming a natural forest which is teeming with indigenous abundant wildlife such as the mule deer and black-tailed deer, squirrels, raccoons, and the list invariably goes on and on. We grow about 20 acres of Christmas trees on our land, along with some tillable timber. Our ancestral home is situated where the original homestead once was, and was renovated and restored to its original pristine condition in 1995, as my father is passionate about the historical heritage and was determined to preserve the traditional historic integrity of our home. Our double-storey symmetrical cream home is highlighted by striking vintage red accents, which are seen in wooden-framed square windows, covered porches, and exterior doors, providing a vibrant contrast to the creamy white exterior walls. When you approach our family property, you will come to a very stylized black wrought iron gate that is situated on the side of the long dirt road. If you were to ring the intercom system and someone answers for you from inside the house and opens the gate for you, you literally drive down this prepossessing long spirally road that meanders through the valley and is densely shaded by large, graceful, mature oaks. Finally, the road turns to a brick and cobblestone semicircular driveway, and you will have arrived at the homestead. The views from our elegant porch overlook stunning panoramic views directly over one of our ponds, and it is wonderful on a summer's evening to observe the deer congregating at the water to drink. Our conspicuous home is airy, spacious, and a great deal larger on the interior than you would expect, and the snazzy wooden railings and beams in our home come from our own harvested timber from the sequoia and the pine and maple trees on our land, which is something my father boasts about all the time, because it's exceedingly special to have the wooden access in your home come from your own timber that was grown on your own property. I live in a charming abode with my father, mother, and brother Jonathan. The story about how my parents actually met is incredibly romantic. My mother was actually a Vegas showgirl, and her dominant boyfriend at the time was a violent thug who would beat her up if he thought she was looking at someone in the wrong way, as he was incredibly possessive, volatile, and exceedingly jealous, and when he got angry, his unquenchable fury would cause him to erupt like a major volcano, so that he would beat the life out of you with little provocation. There were rumours that abounded around Vegas that a couple of missing Vegas girls may have met their untimely demise on the receiving end of his weighty fists, but if that were indeed the case, he had managed to conceal his tracks superbly, because no evidence was ever uncovered or found against him to arrest him for these preposterous crimes, nor was there anything ever proved, because he was masterful at covering his tracks. I think my mother was naturally drawn to roughneck men who were big bullies because she'd grown up in a very dysfunctional home where her mother was beaten up very regularly by her loutish father, and growing up that was her normal. I think she expected to be beaten up by ruffian men because she had such a dreadful low self-esteem and had no sense of self-worth whatsoever, which was so pitiful, and so it would seem perfectly natural that the attention she invariably received dancing on the strip had elevated her self-assurance ever so slightly, and she was indeed a very talented and beautiful dancer. One day when my father was in Vegas, he found this poor bedraggled woman lying battered, bruised, and half dead in the bushes. I gather she'd been beaten so badly by her suspicious boyfriend Jed that she was virtually unrecognizable. My father immediately called an ambulance as he realized how serious the situation was, and the doctors discovered that her pelvis had been shattered in 4 places, and she had to undergo numerous critical operations, but her career as a dancing showgirl was well and truly over. The doctor said it was an absolute miracle that she was in fact alive. One of her legs was slightly shorter than the other due to the extensive surgery, although thankfully it wasn't noticeable. However, every dancer knows that your legs need to be in perfect alignment to be a great dancer. My mother refused to file any charges against Jed because she knew he had a macho gangster-like friends that were only too eager to do his bidding at any of his requests. So if Jed was indeed imprisoned on her account, my mother was pretty certain that she would mysteriously go missing, never to be seen or heard from again. My father visited my mother regularly as she recuperated in a Vegas hospital. He was in Vegas for that month, drafting some architectural designs for a client. He encouraged my mother to stay at his homestead in Oregon to recuperate because he saw her as a lost soul that needed a helping hand and a friendly face to help her along with her recovery. My mother, who was not financially secure at the time, did not have many choices unless she wanted to return to her horrible boyfriend Jed, and that was not a conceivable option for her. So she accepted my dad's invitation very gladly and graciously, and the rest is history, because ultimately they fell in love. My father was able to enable my mother to gain her self-worth and help her to become a confident, gregarious, lovable and fun-loving person. Both my parents call their love story serendipity because it was such a magical romance, in the modern sense of the word, that just simply was meant to be. Growing up, Jonathan and I would pretty much play together all the time as kids, and with so much land we would go exploring everywhere and anywhere. We adored riding our mountain bikes across the valley and exploring the woods, as well as playing by the magnificent creek. I was a passionate animal lover, and over the years I would rescue animals that needed help, like little fledglings from a nest or a deer that had got caught up in barbed wire, and I would nurse those creatures back to health, sometimes with startling success, which is probably why it's not a surprise that I became a wildlife vet in later years, because I love animals so very much, and I'm passionate about working with wild animals. One day my brother and I were playing happily in the woods, when quite by accident we observed that there was a single-man tent hitched in the woods in our land, and it looked ominously like someone was camping in our woods, but they had not done a great job in concealing their presence from us. There was a sign of a fire pit, pots and pans, and there were binoculars, cameras, books, and all kinds of things stacked neatly in the tent, in neat piles. It was all decidedly odd, because our land was indeed private property, and no one should be camping out here in our woods. We began to snoop around and investigate the tent, and we found tons of pictures of my mother when she was actually a young showgirl, and then there were recent photographs taken of her only days ago on our homestead, when she was actually feeding the chickens outside, or digging in the vegetable bed planting seedlings, and even pictures of her at the local town having coffee and cake with friends. I knew at once that something was very clearly wrong, and someone or someone was spying and stalking her, and it was an airy, terrifying feeling. Worse still, there were pictures of my father, and an angry pen had been scrawled across my dad's pictures with the word dead, and there was a diary with crazy writing scrawled all over it that looked like it had been written by a manic person who was half crazed. However, I did notice that the diary had also recorded the times that my dad was in and out of his offices on our land, and I noticed that the 4 p.m. timeline was circled in a red fountain pen, which looked very nefarious to me. I certainly uncovered enough evidence to know that this man clearly intended to kill my dad and kidnap my mother. I knew at once that whoever he was, and I believed he was Jed, whom had found my mother, possibly after years of searching for her, and had possibly procured the help of a private detective to find her. Over the years my mother had been terrified of Jed actually finding her, and was still having nightmares about him all these years later, but my father felt sure that Jed would just move on with his life. Little did my dad realize the power of Jed's manic, insatiable obsession for my mother. As I was reflecting over the horrifying revelation of Jed's sudden presence on our land, I knew I needed to inform my dad at once, but before I could race back to our house to warn my father about Jed's appearance, we heard a noise very suddenly that stopped us dead in our tracks. My brother and I distinctly heard the crunching of leaves under feet, and we could tell that this was Jed coming back to his tent, so we ran and hid behind a large sequoia tree. As he approached, we got a very good look at him. He was very tall, handsome and strong-looking, but there was something menacing and nefarious about his demeanour. We watched him pacing up and down like a manic man who had something very serious on his mind, which was very troubling because it looked like he was psyching himself up to do something quite terrible, and I was almost certain he was going to kill our father, and I had no doubt in my mind about that. "What's he doing?" I whispered to Jonathan. "He's going into the tent," said my brother. Suddenly Jed was standing outside the tent with a very determined look on his face, and we watched him load his rifle with bullets. It did not look at all good. I realized that Jed had been watching our house, and he knew the routines of our household, and I glanced at my watch, and it was 5 to 4, and that was the time that my father was about to leave the outbuilding where he did his architectural designs for his clients, to return to the house for a cup of coffee and my mother's delicious homemade pumpkin pie. He was about to leave the outhouse, and Jed was now pointing his gun through the trees to aim at my dad as he walked past. That simply could not happen. Jed had to be stopped, I thought, and he had to be stopped now. "No!" I shrieked, darting out of my hiding place and lunging towards Jed, who in seconds beat me up violently with the back of his rifle, without even hesitating, and I was only 15 at the time. "You bloody stupid kids," he protested. "I might have known you'd get in my way." He started waving his gun at me, and demanding I stayed very still or else I was dead. "I know you're trying to kill my dad," I protested. "I know exactly who and what you are, and my mother is well rid of you, and she would never ever want you back under any circumstances. Let me tell you that now." "We'll see about that," he said, spitting at me. "I think once your father is out of the way, your mother will have a change of heart. She was always very weak-willed," he drawled. Suddenly Jonathan ran out of his hiding place and proceeded to pounce on Jed. But Jed was so much stronger and more powerful than my brother, and was pinning and forcing him down, beating him violently with his fists, and things were beginning to look terrifying because Jed was quite simply beating and pounding my brother to death. And in minutes it would be all over for my brother because the fighting was that brutal. I began to scream at the top of my lungs. "Please don't hurt him. Please don't, I beg you. Stop. Please, please won't you stop? Please, you're killing my brother." Suddenly there was this monstrous growl, unlike anything I've ever heard before in my entire life. It was so terrifying that it literally caused the ground to shake, and we could hear someone or something coming, and it was thundering towards us, and whatever this thing was, it had to be colossal in size, because it sounded like a rhino. Jed stopped beating my brother for a second, and I heard him say, "What the heck?" The next thing I knew was that standing before us was this massive, colossal, huge bipedal humanoid ape, covered from head to toe with long, flowing, dark brown hair. And you could tell that this critter was incandescent with fury and rage, and his intense anger was directed towards Jed. There was no doubt about that. Jed looked utterly petrified and began to shake as the creature curled its lips back and growled at him furiously with an aggressive, pugnacious anger. Jed was no match for this dangerous apex predator, and he absolutely knew it. Jed looked pathetic, scrawny and weak next to this King Kong-like creature. Jed was shaking so violently that he was barely coping to aim his rifle at the critter, and try as he might, he just fumbled and failed to get it to focus. Before he got a chance to offload his bullets into the creature pounced on top of him with such a brute force that Jed's body was flattened out under the colossal weight of this creature, pressing down upon him. Imagine 1,000-pound concrete block pinning you down. It was just like that. At first Jed screamed, but finally the screams dissipated, and he became totally soundless. I think the colossal and elephantine weight of this titanic creature, squeezing the life out of his body, had ultimately suffocated him to death, and he lay on the ground, limp and lifeless, like a rag doll. Suddenly I became very afraid that this mysterious creature would turn his violence upon us, but it did not. In fact, the creature checked that Jed was dead by examining the body very carefully with a push of his massive feet, and finally it seemed he was satisfied that Jed was deceased. And then the creature looked up at us with the sparkling brown eyes that were so incredibly beautiful and so lively and warm. And he looked at us as if he was familiar with us, almost as if he knew us. He made a few chattering sounds as if to say, "I do hope you're all right." And then we watched him glide away with a seamless fluidity and grace, like such that we have never ever seen. "What on earth was that?" said Jonathan in amazement. "That creature saved my life. A few more punches from Jed, and I'd be pushing up the daisies by now." My brother and I embraced in a very long emotional hug, and we both literally sobbed and sobbed, because we were so incredibly grateful to be alive, and we knew how close we came to losing our lives, and we were also so happy that Jed was finally dead. "We better call the police," I said, "and tell them absolutely everything that's happened." "I think not," said my brother. "I have a better plan. We leave Jed's body to get scavenged by the coyotes until only his body bones remain. Then I'll place the bones in an area where they can be discovered by the police with no connection to us whatsoever. Mum has been through so much in her life. The last thing she needs is to know that Jed came after her to kill Dad and to kidnap her. I think it will totally destroy and devastate her. And we don't need our dad to know that he came so close to losing his life either. Let them remain happily oblivious to what transpired today. Why should they have to deal with all this emotional drama and hurt? It literally could destroy both Mum and really upset Dad. We don't need to do this to them. I realised my brother was absolutely right, as my mother was still deeply traumatised by her past. It would be like opening up a festering old wound all over again. Jonathan and I burnt the tent, the diary, photographs, and we took all the possessions to the dumpster. Over the years we thought a great deal about the colossal creature that we encountered in the woods, whom we did get to see a couple more times on our land, but only very briefly, because he was gone quite fast. But I will say this, he acknowledged us, he most certainly did. The creature we encountered was very, very huge indeed. I would say he was at least 10 foot, 1,000 pounds, and 4 foot wide, with very long, overlong arms that fell below his knees. We also noticed he was athletic, strong, agile, powerful, and burly, and I think he would have no problems at all in lifting up a car at the drop of a hat. That's how powerful and strong he was. I am certain that creature, which I now know was in fact a Bigfoot, is familiar with our comings and goings, and has observed Jonathan and I playing in the woods together as children. Perhaps he observed us throughout our entire childhood. I think over the years he had become almost like an invisible guardian angel, always watching us in the shadows of the forest, where he remained ever watchful, attentive, but always elusive. I believe he was looking over us because he was very protective over us, ensuring that we were indeed rescued from Jed. I believe when he heard my screams, he came sprinting to my defence and instantly killed Jed with the loyalty of a true friend who has your very best interests at heart. It was not long before Jed's body was indeed a pile of bones and lay scattered all over the forest floor, and was invariably soon eaten by all the scavengers. We had to literally conduct a search to find the bones because they were everywhere, and we collected them together in a huge heap. My brother and I went to drop them off in an area which was frequented by regular dog walkers, and we left all his details, such as his ID, so that he could easily be identified. The police found his body, and it was believed that he had been mauled by a wild animal, which is close to the truth as you can get, I imagine. The trouble with him is that he did associate himself with some rather unsavoury characters, so I'm almost certain people did wonder if there were more nefarious reasons around his death. Once my mother learnt about Jed's death, she was so utterly relieved, and her fears about him finding her finally dissipated, and if it were at all possible, she blossomed and became even more happy. My mother and father took up flamenco dancing together and had the time of their lives. I am glad they never heard the commotion on our land that day, and I am certain we did the right thing keeping my parents in the dark about Jed. I know without a doubt Jonathan's was rescued by Bigfoot that day, and I am eternally grateful that his life was saved. As for Jed, as far as I'm concerned, he deserved everything he got. It's as simple as that, as mercenary and as calculating as that may sound. So there you are. That's my story.
Well, hello there. I hope you enjoyed the omnibus edition. We've got many more coming our way for you to listen to. Sending you love wherever you are in the world, in North America, Canada, Kenya, wherever you may be. I send you lots and lots of love. Thank you for listening to my omnibus, and I really do hope you enjoyed it, because that's the whole idea about it, is to give you some interesting stories to listen to. So until next time, goodbye and good night.